In the year 1237, in the heart of Paris, a scriptorium attached to the Abbey of Saint-Victor hummed with quiet industry. Here, Brother Étienne worked at his craft, creating pages of beauty that would endure for centuries. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to this medieval scriptorium, where we will follow Brother Étienne through the patient, meticulous art of illuminating manuscripts. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Brother Étienne, 41 years old, sat at his oak desk near the tall window, his ink-stained fingers resting lightly on the edge of a fresh sheet of vellum. The spring sunlight streamed through the glass, filtered through the pale linen curtain that softened its brightness. The scent of oak gall ink mingled with the faint smell of chalk dust, and the ever-present hint of beeswax from the candles kept ready for dimmer hours. His graying beard, neatly trimmed, caught the afternoon light as he bent his head to examine the surface before him. The vellum had arrived from the parchment maker 3 days earlier. Étienne ran his palm across its surface, feeling the smoothness that came from careful scraping and stretching. Each sheet had once been calfskin, transformed through patient labor into something that would hold words and colors for lifetimes beyond counting. The cream-colored surface showed no imperfections, no rough patches that might catch his quill or reject the precious pigments he would apply. He reached for the pumice stone kept in a small wooden box at the corner of his desk. The stone, worn smooth from years of use, fit comfortably in his hand. With circular motions, applying barely any pressure, he worked the surface of the vellum, creating an even texture that would accept ink without bleeding. The repetitive motion brought him to his familiar state of deep contentment, the gentle rhythm aligning with his breathing. Around him, 3 other scribes worked at their own desks, their quills making soft, scratching sounds that formed a kind of music in the stillness. When the preparation was complete, Étienne set aside the pumice and selected a piece of charcoal from the selection kept in a clay jar. The charcoal, made from willow branches burned in the monastery's kiln, left marks so faint they would vanish beneath layers of ink and gold. He began sketching the page's layout with movements his hands knew by heart. First, the ruled lines for text, measured with a straightedge of polished wood. Then, the spaces where illuminated letters would bloom like flowers in a garden, and the margins where delicate vines and leaves would eventually wind their way around the sacred words. The afternoon bells rang for none, their bronze voices calling across the abbey grounds. Étienne paused in his work, his hands coming to rest on the desk. He offered a silent prayer, his lips barely moving, before returning his attention to the vellum. The bell's echo faded slowly, replaced by the cooing of doves nesting in the eaves above the scriptorium. By the time the layout was sketched, the light had shifted from bright afternoon to the warmer tones of late day. Étienne stood, stretching his back with care, and crossed to the shelf where pigments were stored in small ceramic pots, each sealed with wax to preserve what lay inside. The cool air near the stone wall felt pleasant after the warmth of the sunlit desk. He selected 3 pots, recognizing them by the symbols painted on their lids before he even broke the seals. The first contained vermilion, ground from cinnabar brought by merchants who traveled routes older than memory. The second held ultramarine, the blue so precious it cost more than gold itself, made from lapis lazuli that had journeyed from mountains far to the east. The third pot held verdigris, the green created from copper plates exposed to vinegar fumes, a color that spoke of spring leaves and growing things. Returning to his desk, Étienne arranged the pots in a row. From a drawer, he took out small shells, each one cleaned and dried to serve as mixing vessels. The shells had come from the market, brought inland by traders who dealt in goods from the distant coast. Into the first shell, he spooned a tiny amount of vermilion powder. The red caught the light, seeming to glow from within. He added a few drops of egg tempera, prepared fresh that morning by the youngest apprentice, who had carefully separated yolks from whites and mixed the yolks with water and a trace of vinegar. With a small wooden stick, worn smooth from years of stirring, Étienne blended the pigment and medium until the consistency pleased him. Not too thick, which would sit heavy on the vellum, and not too thin, which would spread beyond its intended borders. He tested a small stroke on a scrap of parchment kept for this purpose, watching how the color flowed from the brush and settled into the surface. Satisfied, he prepared the blue and green in their own shells, each mixture requiring its own attention, each pigment having its own nature. The first letter he would illuminate was a capital D, which would begin a psalm of praise. He had sketched its form in charcoal, a letter large enough that a small scene could live within its curve. The psalm spoke of morning and evening, of the sun's rising and setting, and so Étienne had planned an image that would echo these words. Within the letter's embrace, he would paint a landscape, simple but complete, showing hills beneath a sky that moved from dawn's rose to twilight's blue. He selected a brush from the collection kept in a cylindrical holder, its bristles made from squirrel tail, fine enough to paint details smaller than a grain of wheat. The handle, smooth from handling, fit naturally between his fingers. Dipping the brush into the blue mixture, he began with the sky, applying the color with strokes that followed the curve of the letter. The ultramarine flowed onto the vellum like water finding its level, and Étienne worked with steady attention, maintaining even pressure, allowing no holidays or gaps in the coverage. The work demanded all of his focus, yet it also freed his mind to rest in a place beyond words. His breathing found its own pace, slow and measured. The monastery's afternoon stillness wrapped around him like wool on a cold day. Through the window came the distant sound of someone chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of axe meeting log, and farther still, the murmur of the Seine as it flowed past the city walls. When the blue was applied, he cleaned his brush in a small vessel of water, then dried it carefully on a piece of linen. The vermilion came next, placed along the hills at the bottom of the scene, suggesting earth warmed by sun. Between blue and red, he would later add touches of green and gold, building layers as a mason builds walls, each course supporting the next. As the colors dried, Étienne turned his attention to the text that would fill the rest of the page. Another sheet of vellum, already ruled and prepared, waited for the words of the psalm to be inscribed in the careful script he had practiced since his youth. He selected a quill, cut from a goose feather, its tip shaped to a precise angle. The black ink in his pot was made from oak galls boiled with iron salts, a recipe old when his teacher's teacher had first learned it. He dipped the quill, letting excess ink drain back into the pot, and touched the tip to the vellum. The first letter formed, its vertical stroke clean and confident. Then the next and the next, words appearing in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The Latin phrases flowed from memory and from the exemplar propped on a small stand beside his desk, a master copy created by the Abbey's most skilled scribe decades ago. Brother Thomas, working at the desk nearest the door, stood and made his way to the cabinet where fresh quills were stored. His footsteps on the stone floor were soft, nearly silent. He selected 2 quills, examined their tips, and returned to his place without speaking. The rule of quiet during work hours was not meant to be oppressive, but rather to create a space where concentration could flourish like plants in tended soil. The afternoon progressed toward evening. Étienne completed 3 lines of text, then 4, his hand moving with the assurance that came from years of repetition. When he paused to rest his fingers, he gazed out the window at the view he knew as well as his own face. The Abbey's kitchen garden spread below, its beds arranged in neat squares. Even from this height, he could make out the green of emerging herbs, the darker foliage of the established lavender bushes that would bloom purple in high summer. A sparrow landed on the window ledge, cocked its head to regard the interior of the scriptorium with one bright eye, then flew away again. Étienne smiled slightly, the expression barely visible, a small moment of gentle amusement in the day's work. He stretched his hands, flexing each finger, feeling the familiar tightness that came from holding the quill for long periods. The scent of bread drifted up from the kitchen, reminding him that the evening meal would come in an hour's time. The monastery's baker had been at work since before dawn, tending the large oven that could hold 20 loaves at once. Étienne's stomach made a small sound of anticipation, though he felt no urgency. The work would pause for supper, then continue if there was light enough, or resume tomorrow morning when the sun returned. He dipped his quill again and continued with the text, the letters forming their steady march across the vellum. The words spoke of giving thanks at all times in all seasons for blessings seen and unseen. Étienne had copied these words before many times, and yet they never grew stale. Each time he wrote them, they seemed to settle into him a little deeper, like rain soaking into earth. When the light began to dim toward dusk, he set down his quill and carefully blotted the last line he had written. The page would remain on his desk overnight, protected by a clean cloth, and tomorrow he would continue. The illuminated letter, now dry enough to receive its next layers, would wait as well. There was no haste in this work, no deadline that pressed upon him with anxious weight. The manuscript would be complete when it was complete, whether that took months or years. Étienne cleaned his brushes and quills with careful attention, rinsing them in fresh water, drying them thoroughly. He sealed the pots of pigment, making certain no air could enter to dry them out or contaminate their purity. The shells he rinsed and set aside to dry, ready to be used again tomorrow. Each small task was performed with the same deliberate care he brought to the illumination itself. The bell for Vespers rang out, its voice calling the community to evening prayer. Étienne rose from his desk, feeling the stiffness in his lower back from the hours of sitting. He moved toward the door, joining the other scribes as they filed out of the Scriptorium and made their way through the cloister toward the Abbey church. The evening air carried the coolness that came with spring twilight. Étienne walked through the covered walkway of the cloister, his leather shoes making barely a whisper against the worn stone. The pillars on his left framed views of the courtyard garden, where shadows had begun to pool beneath the pear trees planted in careful rows. To his right, the cloister wall held small alcoves, each containing a statue of a saint, their features smoothed by centuries of weather before being brought inside for protection. The church rose before him, its entrance marked by a rounded arch decorated with carved vines and pomegranates. Brother Thomas walked ahead, his shorter frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. Behind Étienne came Brother André and Brother Philippe, the other two scribes who shared the Scriptorium's quiet hours. None spoke, but their presence together held a comfortable quality, the ease of those who labor side by side toward common purpose. Inside the church, the air smelled of incense from the earlier service, its sweet smoke having settled into the very stones. Candles burned on the altar and in the side chapels, their flames steady in the still air. Étienne took his place in the choir stalls, the wooden seat shaped by decades of use until it fit the human form with surprising comfort. The oak felt smooth beneath his hands as he rested them on the armrests. The abbot entered, followed by the other brothers of the community, their woolen habits making a soft, rushing sound like wind through autumn leaves. The service began with the familiar cadence of chanted psalms, voices blending in the harmonies that Étienne had known since his youth. He sang the responses from memory, his voice joining the others in praising the end of day and the approach of night. The Latin words rose toward the vaulted ceiling, where ribs of stone met in intricate patterns that caught and held the candlelight. Étienne let his eyes trace these familiar lines, finding in their repetition the same satisfaction he found in the regular spacing of text on vellum. Everything in this place spoke of order, of careful attention, of work done with patience and devotion. When the service concluded, the community filed out in silence, making their way to the refectory for the evening meal. The dining hall occupied the ground floor of a building that faced the cloister's south side. Long tables ran the length of the room, with benches on either side. At the far end, a raised platform held the abbot's table, and beside it stood a lectern where one brother would read aloud during the meal. Étienne found his customary place at the middle table and sat, folding his hands while the blessing was spoken. The scent of food had grown stronger now, making his hunger more apparent. Servers brought wooden bowls of pottage, thick with barley and beans, flavored with herbs from the garden and enriched with small pieces of salted pork. Beside each bowl they placed a round of bread, its crust golden brown, its interior soft and pale. Brother Lucian, the youngest of the scribes, stood at the lectern and began to read from the lives of the saints, his clear voice carrying through the hall without strain. Étienne ate slowly, savoring the simple food, listening to the tale of Saint Benedict and his establishment of monasteries throughout Italy. The story was familiar, but its familiarity brought comfort rather than boredom, like returning to a room one had known since childhood. The pottage warmed him from within, its heat spreading through his chest and belly. He tore pieces from his bread and used them to sop up the rich broth, each bite satisfying in its plainness. A cup of ale accompanied the meal, brewed by the monastery's own brewer using barley and hops from sources the abbey had relied upon for generations. The ale was neither too strong nor too weak, its slight bitterness complementing the food. Around him, his brothers ate with similar attention, none speaking, all listening to the reading or lost in their own thoughts. The silence at meals was not the silence of strangers or of those who had nothing to share, but rather the silence of those who had chosen to make room for something beyond conversation. Étienne found his mind drifting back to the manuscript on his desk, considering how he might approach the next illuminated letter, a capital B that would require a different design, perhaps incorporating the image of a bird or a flowering vine. When the meal ended, the community rose as one and filed out into the evening. Full darkness had arrived while they ate, and stars now showed themselves above the courtyard, visible through the open colonnade of the cloister. Étienne paused to look upward, finding the familiar constellations his father had taught him to recognize in childhood, before he had entered the monastery at age 15. The stars seemed especially bright tonight, sharp points of light against the deep blue that was not quite black. He made his way to the dormitory, a long room lined with simple beds, each separated from its neighbors by a low wooden partition that provided a small measure of privacy. His bed stood third from the eastern window, a position he had occupied for nearly 10 years. The mattress, stuffed with straw that was changed each autumn, rested on a wooden frame raised slightly off the stone floor. Woolen blankets, woven in the abbey's own workshop, lay folded at the foot of the bed. Étienne removed his outer habit and hung it on the peg provided, then knelt beside his bed for private prayers before sleep. His knees found the small cushion placed there for this purpose, and he bowed his head, letting the day's events pass through his mind without grasping at them. The work completed, the work yet to come, the brothers he lived among, the walls that sheltered them all, the greater world beyond those walls that continued its own rhythms of light and darkness, planting and harvest, birth and death. When his prayers were finished, he climbed beneath the blankets and lay on his side, his body grateful for the bed's support after the day's hours of sitting. Through the window came the sound of an owl calling from somewhere in the orchard, its voice low and questioning. Another owl answered from a different direction, and then silence returned, broken only by the gentle sounds of his brothers settling into their own beds. Sleep came easily, as it usually did, pulling him down into its depths without struggle or resistance. Morning arrived with the bell for matins, ringing while the sky still held more stars than light. Étienne rose and dressed in the darkness, his hands knowing where to find his clothes without need of vision. The dormitory stirred with quiet movement as the community prepared for the first service of the new day. Cool air flowed through the window, carrying the scent of dew and growing things. In the church, candles provided the only illumination beyond what pale light came from the eastern windows. The brothers sang the office in voices made rough by sleep, praising the darkness before dawn, acknowledging the mystery of night giving way to morning. Étienne felt the familiar exhaustion that came with these early hours, but beneath it ran a current of peace that carried him through the service. After matins came lauds, and after lauds the community returned briefly to the dormitory, before gathering again for prime as true dawn began to paint the sky with subtle color. The cycle of prayer structured the day like the ruled lines on a page of vellum, providing a framework within which all other activities found their place. Following prime, the brothers filed to the refectory for the morning meal. Bread appeared again, along with cheese and dried apples from the previous autumn's harvest. More ale accompanied the food, and Brother Matthias read from the scriptures while they ate. Étienne chewed slowly, feeling the nourishment entering his body, preparing him for the work that would fill the hours until none. The sun had fully risen by the time he returned to the Scriptorium. Light streamed through the eastern windows, bright and clear, perfect for the detailed work that awaited. Étienne uncovered his desk, revealing the manuscript as he had left it the evening before. The illuminated letter looked back at him, its blues and reds vivid against the cream-colored vellum, waiting for the next layer of detail that would bring it to completion. He prepared his workspace with the same methodical care he brought to all things. Fresh water in the washing vessel, pigments selected and arranged, brushes examined and chosen. The egg tempera from yesterday was no longer fresh enough for the finest work, so he walked to the small preparation room where the apprentice had just finished making a new batch. The young man, perhaps 16 years old, handed over the ceramic jar with both hands, his face serious with the responsibility. Étienne thanked him with a nod and returned to his desk. He poured a small amount of the tempera into a clean shell, then added a tiny measure of gold powder from a precious supply kept locked in the cabinet to which only the master scribes held keys. The gold had been beaten into sheets so thin they would tear at a breath, then ground into powder fine as flour. Mixed with the tempera, it would create a paint that would catch light and throw it back in a way that made the manuscript pages seem to glow from within. With his finest brush, almost impossibly delicate, Étienne began adding gold to the illuminated D he worked from the center outward, following the forms he had sketched and painted the day before. The gold went onto the hills, suggesting sunlight on their slopes. It touched the edges of clouds in the blue sky, creating the effect of dawn breaking. Small dots of gold became stars fading in the morning light, and a thin crescent of gold suggested the moon still visible above the western horizon. Each brushstroke required complete attention. Too much pressure and the delicate bristles would splay, ruining the precise line. Too little and the gold would not adhere properly to the vellum. Étienne's breathing slowed further, his awareness narrowing to the tiny space where brush met surface, where intention became form, where the inner vision took on physical reality. The morning passed in this focused state, time becoming elastic and strange. He might have been working for minutes or hours. The distinction held no meaning. Around him, the other scribes pursued their own tasks, and the scriptorium filled with the particular quality of silence that comes when several people work together without speaking, their concentration weaving itself into something larger than any individual effort. By the time he set down his brush to rest his hand, the illuminated letter had taken on a new richness. The gold caught the morning light streaming through the window and transformed it, making the small landscape within the letter's curve seem somehow deeper than it should be, as though one could step through the vellum into that painted world of hills and sky. Étienne flexed his fingers, working out the stiffness, and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The letter was not yet complete, but it had moved significantly closer to the vision he carried in his mind. Tomorrow he would add the final details, the smallest touches of color and line that would bring everything together. Then he would move on to the next illuminated letter, and the next, working his way through the Psalter page by page, week by week, until the entire manuscript stood complete. He turned his attention to the sheet of text he had been copying, the words of the psalm continuing from where he had left them the previous evening. His hand reached for the quill, found it, and dipped it into the ink pot. The familiar weight of the quill settled between his fingers, and he began to write, each letter forming in its appointed place, the words marching steadily across the page in lines straight as the ruled borders that contained them. The spring sunshine moved across his desk as the morning advanced toward midday. Somewhere in the Abbey, bells marked the passing hours. Brothers went about their various tasks in kitchen and garden, in workshop and infirmary, in stable and storehouse. The monastery functioned as a complete world unto itself, producing what it needed, offering hospitality to travelers, maintaining the cycle of prayer and work that had sustained such communities for centuries. Étienne's quill scratched softly against the vellum, adding its small voice to the larger chorus of the Abbey's daily life. Outside the window, birds sang in the garden. The sky held a few white clouds that drifted eastward on a breeze too gentle to be felt within the Scriptorium's thick stone walls. The text grew line by line beneath Étienne's hand, each letter settling into its place with the calm inevitability of seasons turning. His 41 years had taught him the value of patience, the understanding that all worthy things emerged slowly, built stroke by stroke, day following day without haste or forcing. The psalm spoke of steadfast love, of mercy renewed each morning like dew appearing on grass, and these words seemed to flow through the quill onto the vellum as naturally as water finding its course downhill. Brother Thomas rose from his desk and crossed to the cabinet where additional supplies were kept. His work-roughened hands, stained dark with years of ink handling, selected a fresh cake of ink that needed grinding. He carried it to the preparation table near the northern wall, where a stone mortar and pestle waited. The sound of grinding began, rhythmic and low, the stone turning against stone in circles that Étienne could hear without looking, the noise becoming part of the morning's texture rather than an interruption. The light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, dimming for a moment before returning to brightness. These small changes in illumination meant that Étienne had to adjust constantly, holding the vellum at slightly different angles, ensuring that what he saw now would appear correct later when a reader held the finished manuscript in different light. This skill had taken years to develop, an understanding that lived in his hands and eyes rather than in words or conscious thought. By the time the bells rang for sext, the midday office, Étienne had completed 8 more lines of text. He set down his quill and cleaned it carefully, then covered his work with a linen cloth weighted at the corners to prevent any draft from disturbing the pages. The 4 scribes left the Scriptorium together, their footsteps creating a gentle rhythm as they descended the stone stairs that led to the cloister level. The midday service was brief, its prayers acknowledging the sun's height and the day's center point. Afterward came dinner, the main meal, served in the refectory with the same orderly ritual that governed all communal activities. Today's pottage was made with spring vegetables, the first tender greens from the garden lending their fresh taste to the thick broth. Leeks and young onions provided sharpness, while barley gave body and substance. Bread accompanied the meal, along with a piece of hard cheese that had been aging in the storehouse since winter. Brother Dominic read from the Rule of Saint Benedict, his voice measured and clear, speaking of humility and obedience, of the proper ordering of monastic life. Étienne ate while listening, the words familiar enough that he could let them settle into his awareness without needing to concentrate on each phrase. His body appreciated the food's warmth and nourishment, the simple pleasure of hunger being satisfied in company with others who shared his chosen life. After the meal came a period of rest, an acknowledgement that the body needed respite from labor, especially in the afternoon when energy naturally waned. Some brothers returned to the dormitory for sleep. Others walked in the garden or sat in the cloister reading. Étienne chose to visit the Abbey's library, a room adjacent to the Scriptorium that held the community's collection of manuscripts, some created here, others acquired through gift or purchase over the generations. The library's air smelled of vellum and leather bindings, of the particular mustiness that came from old pages and aged wood. Tall shelves lined the walls, and reading desks stood beneath the windows where light could fall upon opened books. Brother Anselm, the librarian, sat at a small table near the door, his elderly frame bent over a catalog he was updating, recording each manuscript's location and condition with careful script. Étienne moved to a shelf that held psalters created by earlier scribes of this very scriptorium. He selected one carefully, supporting it with both hands, and carried it to a reading desk. The manuscript was perhaps 50 years old, its vellum still supple, its illumination still bright despite decades of use in the choir during services. He opened it gently, turning pages, until he found examples of illuminated letters similar to those he was currently creating. Studying the work of those who had come before him served multiple purposes. It reminded him that he was part of a tradition extending backward through time, connecting him to scribes long dead whose hands had moved across vellum just as his did now. It also provided inspiration and instruction, showing solutions to problems of composition and color that he might adapt to his own work. Each generation of scribes learned from the previous one, and the art evolved slowly, techniques refined and passed along like seeds planted in fertile ground. The illuminated bee he examined showed a bird perched on a flowering branch, the creature rendered with enough detail that he could identify it as a goldfinch, its red face distinctive even in the stylized form the artist had chosen. The gold leaf on this page had been applied with exceptional skill, burnished until it reflected light like a mirror. Étienne traced the forms with his eyes, understanding the sequence of steps that had created this small jewel of color and precious metal. He turned more pages, seeing other letters, other solutions to the challenge of making text beautiful without sacrificing legibility. A capital I incorporated a vertical vine heavy with grapes. A capital M contained two peacocks facing each other, their tail feathers spread in elaborate fans. Each illumination invited the eye to pause, to appreciate beauty, before continuing with the work of reading the sacred words. Time passed in the library's quiet atmosphere. Through the window came the distant sound of someone working in the garden, the scrape of a hoe against earth, the faint voice of a brother speaking to another about which beds needed weeding. A bee entered through the open window, circled the room once and departed again, seeking flowers rather than books. When Étienne felt ready, he returned the manuscript to its place on the shelf, handling it with the reverence due to something precious and irreplaceable. He nodded to Brother Anselm, who looked up from his catalog and smiled slightly, the expression lighting his weathered face for a moment before he returned to his work. The scriptorium felt cool after the library's warmth, the thick walls maintaining an even temperature that protected the vellum and pigments from extremes of heat or cold. Étienne settled at his desk and uncovered his work, seeing it with fresh eyes after the break. The pages looked good, he thought, the text even and clear, the illuminated D growing more complete with each layer of detail. He decided to work on a different page for the afternoon, allowing the morning's gold application time to fully set before adding more to the illuminated letter. He selected a fresh sheet of vellum, already prepared and ruled, and began the text for a different psalm, one that spoke of mountains and valleys, of streams in the desert, of the earth yielding its increase. His quill moved steadily, creating the vertical strokes and curves that formed each letter, the ascenders rising above the line, the descenders falling below it, everything balanced and proportioned according to the strict guidelines he had internalized through years of practice. The afternoon light was different from morning light, warmer in tone, coming from a different angle through the windows. Brother André, at the desk nearest Étienne's, was working on a gospel manuscript, his task involving not just copying but also translating from Greek to Latin, a skill few possessed. His brow furrowed slightly in concentration as he considered a particular phrase, seeking the Latin words that would most faithfully render the Greek meaning without losing nuance or grace. Brother Philippe at the third desk was creating a calendar, marking the feast days and saints' days that structured the liturgical year. His work required precision in a different way, ensuring that dates aligned correctly, that calculations of movable feasts were accurate, that nothing was forgotten or misplaced. He consulted reference books frequently, checking and rechecking, knowing that errors in such a document could cause confusion for years to come. The scriptorium held these different labors in its sheltering space, each scribe contributing to the monastery's larger purpose of preserving and transmitting knowledge, creating beauty, offering glory through the work of hand and eye and disciplined attention. Étienne felt the privilege of this calling, the sense that his life was being spent in pursuit of something that mattered beyond his own individual existence. His quill required resharpening after the afternoon's work wore down its edge. He took out the small knife he kept for this purpose, its blade honed to razor sharpness, and carefully cut the quill's tip at the precise angle needed for the script style he was using. Tiny curls of feather fell onto the desk, and he brushed them aside before testing the newly cut nib on a scrap of vellum. Satisfied, he dipped it into the ink and continued writing. The words emerged in their steady procession, filling the page with black letters that would remain legible for centuries if the manuscript was properly cared for. Étienne thought about the hands that might one day turn these pages, the eyes that would read these words, the voices that would chant these psalms in churches and monasteries not yet built, in times he could not imagine. The work he did today would serve purposes far beyond tomorrow or next year, extending forward through time in ways both humbling and extraordinary. Brother Thomas finished his grinding of ink and brought the fresh mixture to his desk, pouring it into his ink pot with careful attention to avoid spilling even a drop. The new ink glistened, blacker than the old batch, and he adjusted the consistency slightly by adding a few drops of water, testing it on scrap vellum until it flowed exactly as he wished. The afternoon advanced toward evening through gradations so subtle they were invisible in the moment, noticed only when Étienne looked up and realized the light had changed significantly since he last paid attention. The shadows in the scriptorium had lengthened, stretching across the floor, climbing the walls. The warmth had faded from the air, replaced by the cooler temperature that announced evening's approach. He completed the page he had been working on and set it aside to dry, then turned his attention back to the illuminated D. The gold was fully set now, ready for the final details that would complete this particular letter. He prepared his pigments again, mixing small amounts of color in clean shells, selecting brushes appropriate for the delicate work ahead. With green made from verdigris, he added tiny leaves to a vine that grew along the inner curve of the letter, each leaf shaped with 2 or 3 strokes of the brush, stylized but recognizable. Between the leaves, he placed small flowers, dots of red and white and yellow that suggested blossoms without depicting any specific species. These decorative elements would lead the eye around the letter's form, creating movement and life within the static medium of paint on vellum. The work required him to lean close to the page, his face only inches from the surface, his breath carefully controlled so as not to disturb the wet pigment. Each tiny stroke mattered, each placement of color contributing to the overall effect. A flower positioned slightly wrong could unbalance the entire composition. A leaf too large or too small could disrupt the rhythm. But Étienne's hand was steady, guided by decades of experience, moving with the confidence that came from having painted thousands of such details over the years. The brush seemed to know where to go, what marks to make, as though the illumination was emerging through him rather than from him, as though he was discovering something that already existed rather than creating something new. The bells for Vespers rang out across the Abbey grounds, their bronze voices calling the community to evening prayer. Étienne finished the stroke he was making, cleaned his brush, and covered his work. The illuminated D was now complete, every element in place. The letter transformed from simple text into a small window onto beauty, a reminder that the words it introduced were themselves precious and deserving of such elaborate presentation. He joined the other scribes as they left the scriptorium, his body tired from the day's concentrated effort, but his mind peaceful, satisfied with what had been accomplished. The evening service awaited, and then the evening meal, and then the gradual progression towards sleep and the rest that would prepare him for tomorrow's renewal of this daily rhythm. The church welcomed them with its familiar embrace, candlelight warm against the gathering darkness outside. Étienne took his place in the choir and added his voice to the community's song, praising the day's end, acknowledging the approach of night, giving thanks for work completed and work yet to come. The evening meal brought the same comforting simplicity as always, bread and cheese accompanied by a soup made from dried peas that had been soaking since morning. The peas had softened into tenderness, their earthy flavor enhanced by onions, and a handful of herbs that the cook had gathered from the shelves where bundles hung drying throughout the year. Étienne ate slowly, his attention divided between the food and Brother Lucian's reading, which tonight drew from the writings of St. Augustine, meditations on time and eternity that wound through complex thoughts with surprising grace. After the meal, a brief period of recreation allowed the brothers to speak quietly among themselves in the cloister, a release from the day's silence that many appreciated. Étienne walked with Brother André, discussing a particular passage they had both been studying, debating the best way to render a phrase whose meaning seemed to shift depending on which words one emphasized. Their conversation was unhurried, moving at the pace of two men who had known each other for years and felt no need to rush toward conclusions. The spring evening had brought coolness that made Étienne grateful for his woolen habit. Above the cloister, stars had begun their nightly appearance, emerging one by one as the sky deepened from blue to indigo to nearly black. A thin crescent moon hung low in the western sky, its horns pointing upward, reminding him of the gold crescent he had painted earlier in the week within another illuminated letter. When the bell for Compline sounded, the final office of the day, the community gathered once more in the church. This service held a particular quality of quietness, a collective settling as the monastery prepared for sleep. The chanted prayers spoke of protection through the night hours, of trust in divine care, of the soul's rest mirroring the body's need for restoration. Étienne's voice blended with his brother's, rising toward the vaulted ceiling and the darkness beyond. Sleep came easily again, pulling him down into depths where dreams moved like fish beneath the surface of a still pond, visible only in glimpses, forgotten upon waking. The night passed in its ancient rhythm, stars wheeling overhead, owls hunting in the orchard, the Seine flowing past the city walls, the world continuing its vast turnings while the monastery slept within its walls. Morning returned with matins, and the cycle began anew. Étienne rose, dressed, descended to the church, sang the office, returned briefly to the dormitory, then attended lauds and prime as dawn painted the eastern sky with colors that shifted and changed moment by moment. Breakfast followed, simple and nourishing, preparing him for the day's work that awaited in the Scriptorium. The morning light found him at his desk again, uncovering the previous day's work and considering what needed to be done next. The illuminated D was complete, but the page held other letters that required attention, smaller decorated capitals that would receive less elaborate treatment but still needed careful painting. He began with a capital V, painting its strokes in alternating colors, red and blue, creating a pattern that was traditional and pleasing to the eye. Between these decorative elements, he continued copying the Psalm's text, line after line, the words appearing in their proper sequence. His hand had found its rhythm again, that state where consciousness stepped back and training took over, allowing the work to flow without excessive thought or second-guessing. The quill moved, the ink followed, letters formed, and the page gradually filled with the sacred words that had been chanted and sung and copied for centuries beyond counting. Brother Thomas was beginning work on a new manuscript today, a collection of homilies that would serve the monastery's preacher when preparing sermons. His first task involved ruling the vellum, using a straightedge and a stylus that left faint impressions to guide his writing. The process was meditative in its repetition, each line measured and marked with careful attention to maintaining consistent spacing. Brother Philippe had completed his calendar and was now examining it one final time before presenting it to the abbot for approval. His eyes moved slowly across the pages, checking each entry against his reference materials, ensuring absolute accuracy. The responsibility weighed on him, visible in the set of his shoulders, but he performed the verification with methodical thoroughness that left no room for error. The morning unfolded in this atmosphere of concentrated work, each scribe absorbed in his particular task, the scriptorium holding them all in its protective stillness. Through the windows came occasional sounds from the world outside, a cart passing on the street beyond the abbey walls, someone calling to another in the courtyard, the distant hammering from the smith's workshop where tools were being repaired. These sounds seemed to come from a different realm, touching the scriptorium's silence without breaking it. At Terce, the mid-morning office, the community paused for prayer as always. The brief service provided a natural break in the work, allowing stiff muscles to move, tired eyes to rest, hands to relax from their grip on quills and brushes. Étienne stood in his place in the choir, singing the familiar words, feeling the pleasant ache in his lower back that spoke of hours spent leaning over his desk. After the service, instead of returning immediately to the scriptorium, he walked to the abbey's garden. The beds had been freshly turned in preparation for spring planting, the dark earth giving off its rich scent of decay and renewal mixed together. Young plants were already visible in some sections, their green shoots pushing up through the soil, reaching toward sunlight. Brother Ambrose, the gardener, was working among the herb beds, his elderly hands moving with surprising deftness as he thinned seedlings to give the strongest plants room to flourish. Étienne paused to watch, recognizing in the gardener's work a kinship with his own. Both involved patience, attention to detail, understanding that growth could not be rushed but only tended and encouraged. Brother Ambrose looked up, nodded in greeting, and returned to his task without speaking. The two men shared a moment of companionable silence before Étienne continued his walk around the garden's perimeter. Bees worked among the early flowers, their buzzing creating a low drone that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the morning's warmth. A robin landed near the garden wall, cocked its head listening for worms, then suddenly stabbed its beak into the earth and emerged with its prize. The bird flew off toward a nest somewhere in the eaves, and Étienne smiled slightly, his characteristic expression of gentle amusement at the world's small wonders. He returned to the scriptorium refreshed, his mind clear, his body grateful for the movement after the morning's stillness. The vellum waited on his desk, patient and uncomplaining, ready to receive whatever marks he chose to make upon its surface. He settled into his seat, arranged his materials, and took up his quill once more. The afternoon's work involved beginning a new page that would feature a particularly elaborate illumination, a capital A that would contain an entire scene showing King David playing his harp. This would require preliminary sketches, planning the composition so that all elements fit within the letter's form while maintaining proper proportion and balance. Étienne began with light charcoal marks, roughing in the basic shapes, the king's figure, the harp's curve, the architectural elements that would suggest a palace setting. This planning stage always felt different from the execution that would follow. It was more exploratory, more willing to make mistakes and corrections, seeking the right arrangement through trial and adjustment rather than working from certainty. Étienne tried different positions for David's hands on the harp strings, different angles for the instrument itself, different amounts of detail in the background. The charcoal could be easily erased with a piece of bread if a particular choice proved unsatisfactory, allowing him to experiment without commitment. Brother André paused in his own work to stretch his arms above his head, then rose and walked to the window, looking out at the afternoon view. He stood there for a long moment, simply gazing at the garden and the sky beyond, giving his mind a rest from the demanding work of translation. Étienne understood this need, having felt it himself countless times, the necessity of stepping back occasionally to maintain freshness of vision and clarity of thought. The charcoal sketch gradually took form beneath Étienne's hands, the composition finding its proper arrangement through small adjustments and refinements. David's figure emerged seated on a low stool, his body angled slightly to accommodate the harp's size, his face shown in profile with eyes downcast toward the instrument. The harp itself curved gracefully, its frame decorated with carved details that Étienne would render in gold once he reached that stage. Behind the king, simplified architectural elements suggested walls and columns without overwhelming the central figures. When he was satisfied with the sketch, Étienne set it aside to consider overnight. Often, problems invisible during the work revealed themselves when viewed fresh the next day, and it was better to discover these issues at the sketch stage rather than after applying permanent ink and pigment. He turned to other pages, continuing with the text copying that formed the majority of his daily labor, the illuminations being precious jewels set among acres of more modest but equally necessary work. The afternoon light moved across his desk in its predictable arc, marking time's passage more reliably than any mechanical device. Étienne's quill scratched softly, regularly, creating its small music that harmonized with the similar sounds from his fellow scribes' desks. Together, they produced a kind of chorus, the sound of knowledge being preserved, beauty being created, tradition being maintained through the simple act of careful attention repeated day after day, year after year. A dove landed on the window ledge, its soft cooing audible in the scriptorium's quiet. The bird preened its feathers, unafraid of the human presence nearby, accustomed to the peaceful atmosphere of this place where sudden movements and loud sounds were rare. Étienne glanced at it briefly, appreciating its presence without allowing his attention to stray far from the page before him. The psalm he was copying spoke of dwelling in the house of the Lord, of beauty and holiness, of worship offered in sacred spaces. As he formed the letters, Étienne reflected that this work itself was a kind of worship, an offering of skill and time and careful attention in service of something greater than himself. The manuscript would outlast him by centuries, carrying these words forward to readers yet unborn, continuing to serve its purpose long after his hands had stilled and his voice had fallen silent. Brother Philippe completed his verification of the calendar and gathered the pages carefully, preparing to take them to the abbot's study. He moved with visible relief that this exacting task was finished, though Étienne knew that Philippe would begin another demanding project soon enough, unable to rest long in idleness. Such was the nature of their calling, always another manuscript needed, another text requiring copying, an endless supply of work for those with the skills and patience to perform it. The bells for none rang across the abbey, their clear tones marking the midpoint of the afternoon. Étienne completed the line he was writing and carefully set down his quill, blotting the final letters before covering his work with the protecting cloth. The four scribes moved together toward the door, their departure from the Scriptorium as synchronized as their arrival had been hours earlier, though no word passed between them to coordinate this movement. Years of shared routine had created an understanding that needed no discussion. The service was brief, as always at this hour, acknowledging the sun's decline toward evening without dwelling on what remained of the day. Afterward, rather than returning immediately to work, Étienne chose to visit the abbey's small cloister garden, a space enclosed on all sides by covered walkways, its center planted with flowering shrubs and a single ancient apple tree whose blossoms were just beginning to open. The tree's branches, gnarled and twisted by decades of growth, spread in patterns that pleased the eye with their organic complexity. White petals, tinged with the palest pink, caught the afternoon light and seemed to glow from within. The scent of the blossoms drifted through the cloister, sweet without being cloying, promising fruit that would come in autumn if the spring proved kind and the summer brought sufficient rain. Étienne walked slowly around the perimeter of the garden, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his gaze moving from the blossoming tree to the beds of herbs planted beneath the windows. Lavender showed its first gray-green growth, though it would not bloom for months yet. Rosemary, which had survived the winter protected by the cloister's walls, spread dark and fragrant, its needle-like leaves releasing their sharp scent when brushed by passing robes. Brother Anselm, the elderly librarian, sat on a stone bench beneath the apple tree, his face lifted toward the blossoms, his eyes closed. He appeared to be praying, or perhaps simply resting, enjoying the warmth and the perfumed air. Étienne did not disturb him but continued his slow circuit, finding in the walking a different kind of meditation than the stillness of his desk provided. A blackbird sang from somewhere in the tree's branches, its song elaborate and confident, filling the cloister with melody that seemed to celebrate the season's turning. Another bird answered from a different location, and for several moments the two engaged in a musical conversation, whose meaning Étienne could only guess at, but whose beauty required no translation. When he felt sufficiently rested, he returned to the Scriptorium and his waiting desk. The afternoon's remaining hours would be spent on text copying rather than illumination, allowing his eyes respite from the close, detailed work that the decorated letters required. He uncovered his vellum and found his place in the psalm, his quill resuming its movement across the page as naturally as breathing resumed after being held. The words he copied spoke of steadfastness, of faithfulness enduring through generations, of promises kept across expanses of time that reduced individual human lives to the briefest flickers. Étienne thought about the scribes who had copied these same words centuries ago, whose manuscripts had provided the exemplars from which he now worked, and about the scribes who would come after him, copying from manuscripts he was creating today, an unbroken chain of hands and eyes and patient attention stretching backward and forward through time's river. Brother Thomas had reached a difficult passage in his work, a section where the exemplar's text was unclear, perhaps damaged or faded, making it hard to determine the correct reading. He rose and carried his manuscript to Brother André's desk, seeking the older scribe's opinion on how to proceed. The two bent over the page together, discussing the possibilities in low voices that barely disturbed the Scriptorium's peace. After some consideration, they reached agreement on the most likely reading, and Brother Thomas returned to his desk to continue. These moments of consultation happened regularly in the Scriptorium, reminders that despite the solitary nature of the work, the scribes formed a community of shared knowledge and mutual support. No one knew everything, but together they possessed enough skill and learning to solve most problems that arose. This collective wisdom, built over generations and preserved through teaching, formed one of the monastery's greatest treasures, as valuable in its way as any gold or jewels locked in the abbey's strong room. The afternoon light began its slow transition toward evening, the angle growing more acute, the color deepening from bright white toward amber and gold. Étienne continued writing, his hand maintaining its steady rhythm, adding line after line to the growing page. The vellum before him would eventually become part of a psalter that might serve the monastery for a century or more, used daily in the choir, handled by countless hands, its pages turned thousands upon thousands of times before Ware finally made it necessary to create a replacement. He thought about this future life awaiting the manuscript, all the voices that would chant from these pages, all the eyes that would read these words, all the hearts that would find comfort or inspiration or simple focus in the familiar verses. The work he did today would echo forward through time in ways both profound and humble, a small contribution to the great river of prayer and praise that had flowed through the church since its beginning, and would continue flowing until time itself reached its conclusion. A cool breeze entered through the open window, carrying the scent of the river and the city beyond the abbey walls. Paris spread around them, full of life and commerce, artisans and merchants, nobility and common folk all going about their business in the spring afternoon. But here in the Scriptorium, that busy world felt distant, separated not just by stone walls, but by the particular quality of time that existed within the monastery's boundaries, where hours were marked by prayers rather than transactions, where success was measured in careful work completed rather than profit accumulated. Brother Philippe had returned from his meeting with the abbot, his face showing quiet satisfaction. The calendar had been approved without corrections, and he carried with him a new commission, a request from another monastery for a martyrology that would record the feast days of saints throughout the year. This would be his next project, another demanding work requiring extensive research and cross-referencing of sources. But Philippe approached it with visible eagerness, already planning his strategy for organizing the vast amount of information he would need to compile. Étienne completed another page and set it carefully aside to dry, adding it to the small stack that represented the week's progress. Each completed page brought satisfaction, a tangible measure of time well spent, of purpose fulfilled. The stack would grow steadily over the coming weeks and months, and eventually these individual pages would be gathered and bound, transforming from separate sheets into a unified manuscript, a complete Psalter ready for use. The bells for Vespers announced the approach of evening. Étienne cleaned his quill and brushes with the thoroughness that had become second nature, ensuring that no dried ink or pigment would ruin these essential tools. He covered his work, tidied his desk, and joined the other scribes as they prepared to leave the Scriptorium for the evening service. Walking through the cloister toward the church, Étienne noticed how the evening light transformed familiar spaces, casting long shadows that emphasized the rounded arches, illuminating the carved capitals atop the columns with warm color that would fade within the hour as night arrived. The day's warmth was giving way to coolness, and he drew his hood up over his head, grateful for the wool's protection. The church interior glowed with candlelight, dozens of flames creating a constellation of warm points against the gathering darkness. Étienne took his place in the choir stalls and added his voice to the community's song, the evening office flowing through its appointed sequence of psalms and prayers. The words were so familiar that his mouth formed them without conscious thought, allowing his mind to rest in a space beyond language, a stillness that held everything without grasping at anything. When the service ended, the community processed to the refectory for supper. Tonight's meal featured eggs prepared simply, boiled in their shells and served with bread and a dish of soft cheese made from milk provided by the abbey's small herd of cows. A salad of early greens from the garden added freshness, the leaves dressed with vinegar and a precious drop of oil. Étienne ate with appreciation for these simple foods, recognizing the labor that had brought them to the table, the gardener's care, the cook's skill, the community's shared work that made such provision possible. Brother Matthias read from the lives of the Desert Fathers, tales of those who had sought God in the wilderness of Egypt and Syria centuries ago. The stories spoke of extraordinary asceticism and equally extraordinary grace, of hermits who had wrestled with demons and entertained angels, whose prayers had worked wonders and whose wisdom had drawn seekers from across the known world. Étienne listened while eating, finding in these ancient accounts both inspiration and the recognition that holiness took many forms, that some were called to the desert's solitude, while others served through community and shared labor. After supper came the brief recreation period, and Étienne found himself walking with Brother Ambrose, the gardener, who spoke with quiet enthusiasm about the plantings planned for the coming weeks. Onions and leeks would go into the ground soon, along with cabbages and turnips that would provide sustenance through the summer and into autumn. The bean beds needed preparation, and the fruit trees required pruning where winter damage had left broken branches. Ambrose's weathered face showed deep contentment as he discussed these plans, his connection to the earth and its cycles as profound in its way as Étienne's connection to vellum and ink. They paused near the herb garden, and Ambrose bent to pinch a leaf from the mint that was spreading vigorously in its designated bed. He crushed the leaf between his fingers and held it out for Étienne to smell, the sharp, clean scent instantly recognizable. This simple gesture, sharing a moment of sensory pleasure, required no words beyond Ambrose's slight smile and Étienne's nod of appreciation. The bell for Compline called them back to the church for the day's final office. The service felt like a gentle closing, acknowledgement that the day's work was done and rest awaited. The chanted prayers asked for protection through the night hours, for peaceful sleep and dreams undisturbed by fear or anxiety. Étienne's voice joined his brother's, offering this last chorus before silence descended on the community until morning. In the dormitory, he prepared for sleep with the same methodical care he brought to his work, hanging his habit on its peg, placing his shoes neatly beneath the bed, kneeling for private prayers before climbing beneath the blankets. The mattress received him with familiar comfort, and he lay listening to the sounds of the community settling for the night, small movements and soft footsteps gradually fading into stillness. Through the window came the night breeze, cool and fresh, carrying scents of earth and water and growing things. An owl called from the orchard, its voice both questioning and certain, speaking into the darkness with ancient authority. Étienne's breathing slowed, deepened, as sleep approached with gentle inevitability. His last conscious thought touched briefly on the manuscript waiting on his desk, the work that would continue tomorrow and the day after, and all the days stretching ahead until this particular Psalter reached completion. Then even that thought dissolved, and he drifted down into the deep rest that prepared body and mind for the endless renewal of each new dawn, each fresh beginning, the great wheel of days turning through seasons and years, carrying him forward through the quiet unfolding of his chosen life. Morning arrived with its familiar rhythm, the bell for matins pulling Étienne gently from sleep's depths. He rose in the darkness, his movements slow and steady, finding his clothes by touch rather than sight. Around him, his brothers stirred quietly, each man emerging from his own private dreams into the shared reality of another day's beginning. The cool air held the last traces of night, and Étienne drew his habit close as he made his way down the stone stairs toward the church. Candles burned on the altar, their flames barely moving in the still air. The community gathered in the choir, voices lifting in the first prayers of the new day, praising the darkness that preceded dawn, acknowledging the mystery of renewal that came with each sunrise. Étienne sang the responses from memory, his mind not quite fully awake but his body knowing what to do, carrying him through the service on the strength of years of repetition. Lauds followed as the sky beyond the windows began its gradual lightening, that subtle shift from black to deepest blue that preceded the sun's appearance. By the time prime concluded, true dawn had arrived, painting the eastern horizon with delicate washes of rose and gold. Étienne felt the day settling into him, his awareness sharpening, his body preparing for the work ahead. Breakfast brought porridge cooked from oats, served with a drizzle of honey and a cup of warm milk. The simple food provided warmth and energy, and Étienne ate mindfully, tasting the sweetness of the honey, feeling the porridge's comforting weight in his stomach. Brother Lucien read from the epistles while they ate, his young voice clear and confident, speaking of faith and hope, of endurance through difficulties, of communities bound together by common purpose. When the meal ended, Étienne made his way to the Scriptorium through the cloister, passing the garden where morning mist still clung to the low places, slowly dissolving as sunlight reached the earth. Brother Ambrose was already at work among the beds, his hoe moving rhythmically, turning soil, preparing ground for planting. The gardener's devotion to his task mirrored Étienne's own approach to illumination, both men understanding that worthwhile things grew slowly, nurtured by patient attention. The Scriptorium welcomed him with its familiar atmosphere, the scent of vellum and ink, the quality of light streaming through the eastern windows. Étienne uncovered his desk and examined the sketch he had made the previous afternoon, the capital A that would contain King David with his harp. Looking at it with fresh eyes, he saw immediately that the harp's position needed adjustment, angled slightly more toward the viewer to better display its form. He took up his charcoal and made the correction, erasing the previous lines with a piece of bread, drawing the new position with careful strokes. This willingness to revise, to see problems and address them rather than stubbornly proceeding with flawed work, had been one of the hardest lessons of his apprenticeship. His teacher, Brother Edmund, now deceased these 7 years, had emphasized repeatedly that pride had no place in the Scriptorium, that serving the manuscript's needs mattered more than protecting one's ego. Étienne had taken that lesson to heart, and it had made him a better scribe, more patient with himself, more willing to start over when necessary. With the sketch corrected, he began the next phase, outlining the composition in ink using a very fine pen. These lines would provide the structure for all the color and detail that would follow, defining edges and boundaries, establishing the framework within which the illumination would take form. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, each stroke considered before being committed to the vellum. Mistakes at this stage would be difficult to correct, so care was essential. Brother Thomas arrived at his desk and began preparing his workspace, arranging his materials with the same orderly attention that Étienne had observed countless times. Despite years of working together, Thomas still performed this morning ritual with unvarying thoroughness, never taking shortcuts or assuming that anything from yesterday remained adequate for today. This conscientiousness was part of what made him an excellent scribe, his work consistently clean and accurate. Brother André entered shortly after, moving more slowly than usual, his joints stiff from the previous day's long hours of sitting. He settled into his chair with visible relief and sat quietly for several moments before beginning his work, allowing his body time to adjust to the day's demands. The older scribe had confided recently that he wondered how many more years he could continue this work, whether his hands would eventually fail him, forcing retirement to less demanding tasks. But for now, he persisted, translating Greek texts with skill few in the monastery could match. The morning unfolded in the scriptorium's characteristic silence, broken only by the soft sounds of quills on vellum, the occasional turning of an exemplar's page, the quiet footsteps of someone crossing to the supply cabinet. Étienne worked on the capital A's outline, defining King David's robed figure, the curve of the harp, the architectural elements suggesting a palace. Each line required focus, the tiny pen tip needing to be frequently re-dipped in ink, the flow of black across cream requiring constant monitoring to ensure evenness. By the time Terce arrived, the outline was perhaps halfway complete. Étienne covered his work and joined his brothers for the mid-morning office, grateful for the opportunity to stand and move after the concentrated stillness of the past hours. The brief service refreshed him, and he returned to his desk with renewed energy. The afternoon would bring the completion of the outline and perhaps the beginning of color application if time permitted. But for now, he simply continued the work before him, stroke by stroke, allowing each line to emerge in its proper place and time. The harp strings appeared one by one, fine parallel lines that would later receive touches of gold. David's hands took shape, one resting on the instrument's frame, the other positioned as though plucking melody from the waiting strings. Through the window, Étienne could see clouds moving across the sky, their shadows sweeping over the garden and courtyard in slowly shifting patterns. The weather seemed settled, no threat of rain, the spring day mild and pleasant. These conditions were ideal for his work, the steady light making it easier to see fine details, the moderate temperature keeping the ink flowing smoothly without becoming too thin or too thick. Brother Philippe was beginning his martyrology project, consulting several reference books simultaneously, making notes on wax tablets that he could later transfer to vellum once he had verified the information's accuracy. His desk was covered with open volumes, creating a landscape of pages and bindings that somehow made sense to him despite appearing chaotic to outside observation. Philippe had always worked this way, surrounding himself with sources, cross-referencing constantly, building his texts from multiple foundations rather than relying on any single authority. Étienne completed David's face, giving the king a contemplative expression, eyes downcast toward the harp, mouth slightly curved in what might be the beginning of song. The face was stylized rather than realistic, following the conventions of manuscript illumination, but still managed to convey a sense of peaceful concentration, of a musician lost in the act of making melody. The bells for sext marked midday, and the community gathered once more for prayer before proceeding to dinner. Today's main meal featured a fish pottage, the fish having been purchased from a vendor who brought his catch from the Seine each morning. The flesh had been carefully deboned and added to a thick broth with vegetables, creating a dish both nourishing and flavorful. Bread and cheese accompanied the meal, along with a cup of ale that tasted faintly of the barley from which it had been brewed. Brother Dominic read from the chronicles of earlier abbots, recounting the abbey's history, the challenges faced and overcome, the growth of the community from its founding to the present day. Étienne listened while eating, finding in these historical accounts a reminder that he was part of something larger than himself, a tradition extending backward through generations and, God willing, forward through generations yet to come. The afternoon rest period found Étienne in the cloister once more, walking slowly around the covered arcade, his hands clasped behind his back. The apple tree's blossoms had opened further since yesterday, their white and pink petals now fully displayed, creating a canopy of delicate beauty. Bees worked among the flowers, their buzzing a constant presence, their industriousness serving purposes that would only become apparent months later when fruit began to form. He paused at one of the cloister's corners, where a small fountain provided water for washing hands before meals. The fountain's basin was carved from a single piece of stone, worn smooth by centuries of use, its surface cool to the touch. Water flowed from a bronze spout shaped like a lion's head, a steady stream that fell into the basin with a sound that seemed both lively and peaceful, movement and stillness combined in a single continuous gesture. Étienne dipped his hands into the water, feeling its coolness against his skin, watching how the light played across the surface, creating patterns that shifted and changed moment by moment. He dried his hands on a cloth kept nearby for this purpose and continued his walk, completing the circuit around the cloister before returning to the Scriptorium. The afternoon's work saw the outline of the capital A completed, every element defined and ready for color. Étienne prepared his pigments, selecting vermilion for David's robes, ultramarine for the background sky visible through palace windows, green for decorative elements that would frame the scene. He mixed each color in its shell, testing the consistency, adjusting until each paint flowed exactly as he wished. With his medium brush, he began applying the vermilion to David's outer robe, working from top to bottom, maintaining even coverage, ensuring no holidays or thin spots marred the surface. The red was magnificent, rich and warm, seeming to glow against the cream-colored vellum. Layer by layer, the illumination came to life, flat outlines transforming into something that had depth and presence, that drew the eye and held attention. Brother Thomas completed a page of his homily manuscript and held it up to examine in the afternoon light, checking for any errors he might have missed during the writing. Finding none, he set it carefully aside and began the next page, his quill resuming its steady movement. The rhythm of his work never seemed to vary, each day bringing the same measured progress, pages accumulating like snow falling steadily through a winter afternoon. The afternoon light moved across Étienne's desk, marking time's passage. He worked steadily, adding color to the illumination, building up layers where needed, allowing each application to dry before adding the next. The capital A was beginning to show its full potential, the composition balanced and harmonious, King David emerging as a figure both dignified and human, engaged in an act of worship through music. When the bells for none sounded, Étienne was applying ultramarine to the background, the precious blue creating a space that suggested both sky and something beyond sky, a heavenly realm where earthly music found its echo and completion. He paused at a natural stopping point, cleaned his brush, and joined his brothers for the afternoon office. The service was brief as always, but Étienne found himself particularly attentive to the psalm being chanted, recognizing it as one he had copied just days earlier. Hearing the words sung aloud gave them new dimension, reminding him that these manuscripts existed not as objects to be admired, but as tools for worship, vessels carrying prayer from one generation to the next. Returning to the Scriptorium, he continued with the illumination, adding touches of green to decorative vines that wound around the letter's outer edge, placing small dots of white to suggest highlights on David's robe, creating the illusion of fabric catching light. Each small addition refined the overall effect, bringing the composition closer to the vision he had held in his mind since first sketching the design. The capital A would require one more day's work, perhaps two, to reach completion. The gold had yet to be applied, those final touches that would make the illumination truly sing. But already it was clear that this would be one of the manuscript's finest letters, worthy of the psalm it introduced, appropriate to the sacred words it adorned. The afternoon advanced toward evening through subtle gradations of light and shadow. Étienne worked on, his attention absorbed by the tiny space before him, his awareness narrowed to brush and pigment and vellum, to the slow emergence of beauty through patient application of skill learned over decades of practice. The evening bells for Vespers found Étienne completing a delicate vine that curled along the inner curve of the capital A, its tendril ending in a stylized leaf that seemed to reach toward King David's harp. He finished the final stroke, set down his brush, and sat back slightly, allowing his eyes to rest on the illumination as a whole rather than focusing on individual elements. The composition pleased him, balanced and harmonious, each part serving the whole without competing for attention. He cleaned his brushes with particular care, knowing that pigments left to dry in the bristles would ruin these precious tools. The water in his washing vessel turned cloudy with suspended color, swirls of blue and red and green mingling together before settling toward the bottom. He dried each brush thoroughly, reshaping the bristles to points, then set them aside to finish drying overnight. The walk to the church for Vespers brought him through the cloister as twilight was gathering, that hour when the world seemed suspended between day and night, belonging fully to neither. The apple tree's blossoms glowed palely in the dimming light, visible even as other details faded into shadow. Somewhere beyond the abbey walls, a dog barked, the sound carrying clearly through the evening stillness, then falling silent again. In the church, candles had been lit against the growing darkness, their flames creating pools of warm light that pushed back against the shadows accumulating in corners and beneath arches. Étienne took his place in the choir and added his voice to the evening office, the familiar words flowing without conscious effort, his mind resting in that space where prayer and peace became indistinguishable from each other. The evening meal brought lentil pottage, thick and savory, seasoned with onions that had been slowly cooked until they turned sweet and mild. Bread accompanied the dish, along with a small portion of dried fruit, apples from the previous autumn's harvest that had been carefully preserved throughout the winter months. The sweetness of the fruit provided pleasant contrast to the lentil's earthy flavor, and Étienne ate slowly, appreciating each element of the simple meal. Brother Lucian read from the Desert Fathers again, tonight focusing on sayings about the value of manual labor, how work offered not just sustenance but spiritual discipline, teaching patience and humility, providing concrete expression of devotion that complemented the more abstract realm of prayer and contemplation. Étienne recognized his own experience in these ancient words, understanding how the repetitive tasks of manuscript creation had shaped him over the years, teaching lessons that sermons and study alone could never have conveyed. After supper, during the brief recreation period, Étienne found himself in conversation with Brother André, who spoke about a particularly challenging passage in the Greek text he was translating. The original seemed to contain a wordplay that was impossible to render directly in Latin without losing either the meaning or the verbal cleverness. They discussed various possible solutions, trying different approaches, neither entirely satisfied with any option but finding value in the exploration itself. The spring evening had brought coolness that made Étienne grateful for the warmth of the refectory they had just left. Stars were appearing overhead, emerging one by one as darkness deepened. The same stars that had shone over the desert fathers whose words they had just heard read aloud. The same stars that would shine over scribes and monks centuries hence, long after everyone currently living within these walls had departed to whatever lay beyond this earthly life. The bell for Compline called them to the day's final office, and Étienne made his way to the church for the last time that day. The service felt like a gentle closing of a circle that had begun with matins in the pre-dawn darkness, the community's prayers marking the hours from night through day and back to night again, an endless cycle that connected each moment to all other moments, past and future woven together in the present's eternal now. In the dormitory, he prepared for sleep with his usual methodical attention, each small task performed with care. When he knelt for private prayer beside his bed, he found himself offering thanks for the day's work, for hands still capable of holding brush and quill, for eyes that could still see the fine details his craft required, for the privilege of spending his life in this particular form of service. Sleep came quietly, drawing him down into its restoring depths. The night passed in its ancient rhythm, the monastery settling into stillness while the world beyond its walls continued its own activities, taverns and households, watchmen making their rounds, bakers beginning the long process of preparing bread for morning. The great city of Paris never entirely asleep, even in the darkest hours. Dawn returned, as it always did, pulling Étienne from sleep with the matin's bell. He rose and dressed, descended to the church, sang the office, the cycle beginning anew. Lauds followed, then prime, each service marking another step in the day's unfolding, another thread in the tapestry of hours that would eventually create this new day's pattern. Breakfast brought porridge again, this time cooked with a handful of dried berries that added small bursts of sweetness. The meal prepared his body for work, and Étienne felt ready to return to the Scriptorium, eager to continue with the capital A that awaited completion. Brother Matthias read from the Psalms during the meal, his voice steady and calm, the familiar words washing over the gathered community like gentle rain on thirsty ground. The morning light in the Scriptorium was particularly fine, clear and steady, perfect for the detailed work ahead. Étienne uncovered his desk and examined yesterday's progress with satisfaction. The colors had dried well overnight, the pigments settling into the vellum, becoming part of its surface rather than merely sitting atop it. Today he would add the gold, those final touches that would transform the illumination from beautiful to extraordinary. He prepared his workspace with special care, knowing that gold application required conditions as perfect as possible. Any dust or moisture could interfere with adhesion, and the precious metal was too valuable to waste through careless preparation. From the locked cabinet, he retrieved the small packet containing gold leaf, each sheet beaten so thin it would tear at a breath, handled only with special tools designed to minimize contact. The adhesive he would use was glaire, made from egg white that had been beaten and allowed to settle overnight, creating a substance that would hold the gold firmly while remaining invisible once dry. He applied the glaire with a fine brush to the areas that would receive gold, working in small sections. The harp's frame first, then decorative elements in the architectural background, finally small highlights on David's crown and the trim of his robes. While the glaire dried to the proper tackiness, neither too wet nor too dry, Étienne prepared the gold leaf. He cut a piece from the larger sheet using a sharp knife, his movements slow and deliberate, breathing carefully to avoid creating any air current that might send the delicate metal floating away. The gold fragment rested on a cushion of soft leather, barely visible, catching light and throwing it back in warm brilliance. Using a tool called a gold knife, a blade so fine it was almost flexible, he lifted the gold fragment and carefully positioned it over the glaire-painted area on the harp's frame. The gold settled onto the adhesive, conforming to the vellum's surface, and Étienne gently pressed it into place using a silk cloth, establishing contact without tearing the fragile metal. Where the glaire had been applied, the gold adhered perfectly. Where there was no adhesive, loose gold could be brushed away with a soft brush and saved for future use, nothing wasted. The process was repeated for each gilded area, requiring absolute concentration, patience unlimited by time pressure or desire to rush toward completion. Brother Thomas worked at his own desk in similar absorption, his quill moving across vellum in the steady rhythm Étienne had come to recognize as distinctly Thomas's own, slightly faster than André's measured pace, slightly slower than Philippe's more urgent movement. The morning advanced through its predictable sequence, sunlight moving across the scriptorium's interior, illuminating first one desk then another as the earth turned beneath the heavens. Étienne completed the gold application and set the page aside to let the adhesive cure fully. Tomorrow he would burnish the gold, rubbing it with a smooth agate stone until it shone with mirror-like brilliance, but for now it needed to rest undisturbed. He turned his attention to text copying, continuing with the psalm that followed the now nearly complete capital A. His quill found its rhythm again, that state where hand and eye work together without conscious direction, letters appearing on the vellum as though emerging from the page itself, rather than being placed there by external agency. The words spoke of making melody to the Lord, of singing praises with understanding, of music offered as worship and thanksgiving. The bells for terce brought their brief interruption, and Étienne joined his brothers for the mid-morning office. Standing in the choir, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from sitting, he felt the pleasant ache of honest labor, his body serving purposes larger than mere physical survival. When the service concluded, he returned to the scriptorium refreshed, ready for the hours of work that remained before midday. Brother Andre was struggling with a particularly complex sentence in his Greek text, his brow furrowed in concentration, his lips moving slightly as he tried different Latin constructions, seeking the phrasing that would capture both meaning and nuance. Étienne glanced over occasionally, recognizing the difficulty though unable to offer assistance, his own knowledge of Greek being limited to a few phrases learned long ago and mostly forgotten. Andre would solve the problem eventually. He always did, drawing on decades of experience and a mind still sharp despite the body's increasing frailties. The morning's text copying proceeded steadily, Étienne completing line after line, his quill requiring occasional resharpening but otherwise functioning perfectly. The ink flowed smoothly, neither too thick nor too thin, maintaining the precise consistency needed for clean letters that would remain legible for centuries. Each stroke connected to the next in an unbroken chain of careful attention, and the page gradually filled with the sacred words that had been copied and recopied through generations beyond counting. By the time Sext arrived, marking midday, Étienne had completed 2 full pages of text. He covered his work and made his way to the church for the brief office, then proceeded with his brothers to the refectory for dinner. Today's meal featured a vegetable pottage enriched with barley, served alongside bread and a wedge of hard cheese that required patient chewing, but rewarded the effort with its rich, complex flavor. A salad of early lettuce from the garden added freshness, the tender leaves dressed simply with vinegar. Brother Dominic read from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the section addressing proper conduct in the oratory, how to approach prayer with reverence and attention, neither rushing through the words nor allowing the mind to wander into distraction. Étienne recognized his own struggles in this teaching, the constant effort required to maintain focus, to keep returning attention to the present moment when thoughts inevitably drifted toward past or future, toward concerns and plans that belonged to other times. The afternoon rest period found him in the library rather than the garden, drawn by the desire to consult a particularly fine Psalter created nearly a century earlier. Brother Anselm located the manuscript for him, handling it with the gentle reverence due to something both precious and fragile. Étienne carried it to a reading desk and opened it carefully, turning pages, until he found illuminations similar in theme to what he was currently creating. The earlier scribe had chosen different compositional solutions, positioning King David differently, rendering the harp with more decorative elaboration, including architectural details that Étienne had simplified or omitted entirely. Yet the fundamental approach was similar, the understanding that an illumination should serve the text rather than overwhelm it, should invite meditation rather than demand mere admiration. Étienne studied these pages with the attention of someone learning a language, recognizing patterns and principles that transcended individual style. When he felt satisfied, he returned the manuscript to Brother Anselm and made his way back to the Scriptorium. The afternoon's work would focus on a different page, beginning the preliminary sketch for another illuminated letter, a capital L that would introduce a psalm of lamentation. This would require a different emotional tone than the joyful David with his harp, something more solemn and contemplative, though still peaceful rather than disturbing, in keeping with the manuscript's purpose. He began with light charcoal marks, roughing in possibilities, trying different compositions. Perhaps a single figure in prayer, hands raised, face lifted toward heaven. Or perhaps a more abstract design, incorporating symbolic elements rather than representational figures. The afternoon passed in this exploratory work, erasing and redrawing, seeking the right balance between tradition and creativity, between what was expected and what would bring fresh insight to familiar words. Brother Philippe had made significant progress on his martyrology, his wax tablets covered with notes that would eventually be organized into proper entries. He worked with visible concentration, frequently consulting his reference books, cross-checking dates and details, ensuring accuracy that would make the finished manuscript reliable for generations of users. The light shifted as afternoon moved toward evening, and Étienne found himself satisfied with the sketch he had developed for the capital L. The capital L would feature a single figure kneeling in prayer, head bowed, hands folded at the chest in a gesture of supplication and surrender. Behind the figure, Étienne had sketched simple architectural elements suggesting a church interior, columns rising to support rounded arches, a suggestion of sacred space without overwhelming detail. The composition felt right, balanced and contemplative, appropriate to the psalm's tone of seeking comfort in times of sorrow. He set the sketch aside and returned to the page with the nearly complete capital A, examining the gold in the afternoon light. The metal had adhered perfectly, showing no gaps or imperfections, ready for tomorrow's burnishing. Satisfaction settled through him, that quiet pleasure that came from work progressing well, from skills applied with care yielding results that honored both the craft and the sacred purpose it served. The bells for none rang out, their bronze voices carrying across the abbey grounds and beyond, audible even in the city streets where merchants and artisans paused briefly in their own labors to mark the hour. Étienne covered his work and joined his brothers for the brief afternoon office, grateful for the opportunity to stand and move after hours of sitting hunched over his desk. The service was particularly beautiful today, the harmonies of the chanted psalms seeming to weave themselves into something greater than the sum of individual voices, creating a tapestry of sound that filled the church's vaulted space. Étienne closed his eyes and simply listened, allowing the music to wash over him, cleansing away the small tensions and preoccupations that accumulated during focused work. When the office concluded, he chose to walk in the Abbey's orchard rather than returning immediately to the Scriptorium. The orchard occupied a space beyond the main cloister, accessible through a wooden gate that was kept oiled so it opened silently. Here, fruit trees grew in ordered rows, apple and pear and cherry, their branches showing various stages of spring awakening. Some were fully covered in blossoms, others just beginning to open, the progression determined by species and the particular microclimate each tree occupied. The grass beneath the trees had grown tall enough to brush against his ankles as he walked, and small wildflowers bloomed among the green blades, white and yellow and pale blue. Bees worked among the blossoms overhead, their activity essential to the fruit that would appear in late summer and autumn, though the insects themselves knew nothing of this larger purpose, simply following instincts planted deep within their small bodies. Étienne paused beneath a cherry tree whose blossoms had reached full glory, clouds of white petals tinged with the faintest pink catching the afternoon light. A slight breeze stirred the branches, and a few petals detached, drifting down like snow, landing on his shoulders and in the grass around his feet. The moment held a quality of perfection that seemed both eternal and impossibly fragile, existing fully in the present while already passing into memory. Brother Ambrose was working at the orchard's far end, examining fruit trees for signs of disease or damage, his experienced eyes noting details that would escape less trained observers. He moved from tree to tree with unhurried purpose, occasionally pruning away a damaged branch with sharp shears, the cuts clean and precise, promoting healing rather than creating wounds that might harbor rot. Étienne watched him for a moment, recognizing again the kinship between all forms of careful work, whether with vellum and pigment or soil and living wood. Both required patience, attention, willingness to serve something beyond oneself. Both demanded that pride be set aside in favor of the work's needs. Both offered in return a sense of purpose that made the days meaningful and the years coherent. He continued his walk, completing a circuit of the orchard before returning through the gate to the main abbey grounds. The walk had refreshed him, clearing his mind, preparing him for the evening's work that remained before Vespers. Back in the Scriptorium, he uncovered his desk and took up text copying again, continuing the psalm he had been working on earlier. The words spoke of trusting in divine providence, of casting cares upon the Lord who sustained all creation, of finding rest in the certainty that the universe was held in loving hands greater than human understanding could compass. As Étienne copied these verses, he thought about how the act of writing them slowly, letter by letter, allowed their meaning to settle into him differently than simply reading them would have done. The physical labor of forming each character created space for the words to work on his heart and mind, transforming him even as he transformed blank vellum into text. Brother Thomas had reached the end of a gathering in his homily manuscript and was now preparing the next section, carefully measuring and ruling fresh vellum. His movements showed the same methodical care he brought to all aspects of the work, nothing rushed, nothing taken for granted. Étienne had known Thomas for nearly 15 years, had watched him progress from nervous apprentice to accomplished scribe, and felt a quiet pride in witnessing this growth, though he had played only a small role in Thomas's development. The afternoon light grew warmer and more golden as the sun descended toward the western horizon. Through the Scriptorium windows, Étienne could see the abbey's kitchen garden, where Brother Ambrose had now appeared after finishing his orchard work, bending to examine the young plants emerging from the carefully tended beds. The gardener's devotion to his tasks never seemed to waver, each season bringing its own demands that he met with steady, patient attention. Brother André completed a page of translation and held it at arm's length, examining it with critical eyes. After a moment, he nodded slightly to himself, apparently satisfied, and set it aside to dry. The older scribe's hands trembled slightly these days, a tremor so faint it was barely visible but significant for someone whose work required absolute precision. Yet André continued, compensating for the tremor through increased concentration, refusing to surrender to limitations that were only beginning to make themselves felt. Étienne completed another page of text and began a fresh sheet, his quill finding its rhythm immediately, requiring no period of adjustment. This state of effortless work, where the body knew what to do without conscious instruction, was one of the great gifts his years of practice had provided. In his youth, every letter had required thought and attention. Now his hand moved almost independently, guided by knowledge so deeply embedded it had become instinct. The psalm he was copying shifted from lamentation to hope, the verses turning from sorrow toward trust, acknowledging suffering while refusing to be defined by it. This movement from darkness toward light, from despair toward faith, formed a pattern Étienne had encountered countless times in the Psalms, a recognition that human experience included both joy and sorrow, both certainty and doubt, and that wholeness required holding all of it together rather than choosing only the pleasant and comfortable. A sparrow landed on the window ledge, hopping along its length, pausing occasionally to cock its head and peer into the scriptorium with bright, curious eyes. Étienne watched it briefly, appreciating the small creature's liveliness, the way it seemed entirely present in each moment without concern for past or future. Then the bird flew away, off to pursue whatever purposes drove its tiny life, and Étienne returned his full attention to the vellum before him. The bells for Vespers announced the approach of evening, calling the community to prayer as daylight began its slow surrender to darkness. Étienne completed the line he was writing, cleaned his quill, and covered his work. The day's labor was essentially complete, though tomorrow would bring its own tasks, continuing the endless work of manuscript creation that filled his days with purpose and meaning. Walking to the church through the cloister, he noticed how the evening light transformed familiar spaces, casting long shadows that emphasized architectural details, illuminating stone surfaces with warm color that would fade within the hour. The abbey seemed particularly beautiful at this hour, neither fully day nor completely night, existing in that liminal space where transitions occurred, where one state gave way to another. The Vespers service flowed through its appointed sequence, the community's voices rising and falling in ancient patterns of prayer and praise. Étienne sang the responses without conscious thought, his mind resting in that space beyond language where prayer became breath and breath became prayer, indistinguishable and whole. The day's accumulated tensions released during this time of corporate worship, leaving him peaceful and ready for the evening's simple pleasures. Supper in the refectory brought bean pottage flavored with herbs from the garden, served with bread and a small portion of smoked fish, a rare treat that added richness to the meal. The fish had been split and hung in the smokehouse until it took on the distinctive flavor of oak and beechwood smoke, preserving it while transforming its taste into something complex and satisfying. Étienne ate slowly, savoring each element of the simple meal. Brother Matthias read from the lives of the apostles, recounting their journeys and sufferings, their preaching and eventual martyrdoms. The stories were familiar, having been read countless times over the years, yet they never quite lost their power to move and inspire, reminding the community of the courage and devotion that had established the faith they now practiced in relative peace and safety. After supper, the brief recreation period brought Étienne into conversation with Brother Philippe, who spoke enthusiastically about a discovery he had made in his martyrology research. Two different sources had given conflicting dates for a particular saint's feast day, and Philippe had managed to trace the discrepancy to a copyist's error made centuries ago, perpetuated through multiple generations of manuscripts until it had become accepted as fact. Correcting such errors gave Philippe visible satisfaction, his commitment to accuracy making him particularly suited to this demanding work. The spring evening had brought coolness, and Étienne drew his hood up as they walked in the cloister, completing slow circuits while they talked. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, and the first bats of evening swooped through the darkening air, hunting insects with the same focused efficiency that scribes brought to their own very different form of hunting, seeking words and meanings rather than food. The bell for Compline called them to the day's final office, and Étienne made his way to the church for the last time. The service felt like a gentle closing, prayers asking for peaceful rest and protection through the night hours. When it concluded, the community filed out in silence, maintaining the great silence that would last until after prime the following morning, a time when speech was forbidden except in cases of genuine necessity. In the dormitory, Étienne prepared for sleep with his usual careful attention to each small task. He knelt for private prayer, offering thanks for the day's work and blessings, asking for continued strength to serve faithfully in the years that remained to him. Then he climbed beneath the blankets and lay listening to the night sounds, the settling of the building's ancient timbers, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind moving through the orchard's branches. Sleep arrived gently, drawing him down into its restorative depths. The night passed in its eternal rhythm, and when the matin's bell rang in the pre-dawn darkness, Étienne rose to begin another day, the cycle continuing as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, each day both unique and part of an endless pattern that connected past and future in the eternal present moment where all life unfolded. The morning brought him back to the Scriptorium after the early offices and breakfast, back to his desk, where the manuscript waited with patient stillness. Today he would burnish the gold on the capital A, completing that illumination and moving it from nearly finished to truly done. He prepared the agate burnishing stone, a smooth piece of polished mineral that would compress and polish the gold until it shone with brilliant clarity. The work required gentle pressure applied in small circular motions, gradually working over each gilded area until the gold took on its characteristic mirror-like finish. Too much pressure could tear the delicate leaf or damage the vellum beneath. Too little would leave the gold dull and incomplete. Étienne had performed this task thousands of times over his 41 years, and his hands knew exactly how much force to apply, reading feedback from the stone and metal with sensitivity developed through decades of practice. The harp's frame began to glow as he burnished, the gold transforming from merely present to actively radiant, catching light and throwing it back with intensity that seemed almost magical. The same transformation occurred with each gilded area he treated, highlights on David's crown becoming points of brilliance, decorative elements in the architecture beginning to sparkle and sing. By mid-morning, the burnishing was complete, and Étienne set down the agate stone to examine his finished work. The capital A was now truly complete, every element in place, the illumination serving its purpose of drawing the eye, inviting contemplation, honoring the sacred words it introduced. He felt the quiet satisfaction of work well done, of skills faithfully applied, of purposes served through patient, careful attention extended over days and weeks. He turned to a fresh page and began copying text again, his quill moving in its familiar rhythm, adding to the manuscript's growing length, contributing another day's work to a project that would eventually span months or even years before reaching completion. But this understanding of time's vastness did not discourage him. Rather, it settled into him as a kind of peace, the recognition that worthwhile things grew slowly, that his role was simply to show up each day and do the work before him, trusting that the accumulation of days would eventually yield something complete and beautiful and worthy of the sacred purpose it served. The morning light streamed through the scriptorium windows, illuminating his desk, catching the gold in the newly completed illumination, making it flash and gleam like captured sunlight. Étienne's quill scratched softly against vellum, adding its small voice to the larger chorus of the monastery's daily life, the endless work of preservation and creation that had continued for generations and would, God willing, continue for generations more, an unbroken chain of devotion extending through time's great river, carrying forward the light of knowledge and beauty and faith from age to age to age. The morning continued in its steady rhythm, Étienne's quill moving across the vellum in lines that marched with orderly precision down the page. The psalm he was copying spoke of dwelling in God's house, of finding shelter and safety within sacred walls, words that seemed particularly appropriate as he sat within the monastery's protecting embrace, surrounded by brothers engaged in similar devotion to their various tasks. Brother Thomas had reached a section of his homily manuscript that required decorative initials, though nothing as elaborate as the illuminations Étienne created. Thomas prepared red ink, made from the same vermilion pigment but mixed to a thinner consistency suitable for penwork, and began adding flourishes to the capital letters, extending their strokes into delicate curls and spirals that framed the text without overwhelming it. His hand moved with confidence, these simpler decorations well within his considerable skill. The light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, dimming briefly before returning to brightness. These small changes in illumination meant that Étienne adjusted his posture slightly, angling the vellum to catch the best light, a constant subtle dance between scribe and sun that continued throughout every working day. After so many years, these adjustments happened without conscious thought, his body responding to changing conditions as naturally as breathing. Brother André had completed his difficult passage and moved on to a section of the gospel text that flowed more easily from Greek to Latin. His quill moved with visible relief, no longer pausing every few words to consider alternatives, instead progressing steadily through verses whose meaning translated cleanly. The older scribe's face showed less tension than it had the previous day, and Étienne was glad to see it, knowing how draining intellectual struggle could be, especially for someone whose years were beginning to accumulate weight. By the time Terce arrived, Étienne had completed 3 more pages of text. The progress felt satisfying, tangible evidence of time well spent. He covered his work and joined his brothers for the mid-morning office, standing in the choir to sing the appointed psalms, his voice blending with the others in harmonies that had echoed through this space for generations. After the service, instead of returning immediately to the Scriptorium, he walked to the Abbey's chapter house, where the community gathered each morning for the reading of a chapter from the Rule of Saint Benedict and for discussion of practical matters affecting the monastery's daily life. The chapter house was a square room with stone benches built into the walls, simple and functional, its only decoration a wooden crucifix mounted on the eastern wall. The abbot stood at the room's center, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, his face weathered but kind, his voice still strong despite his age. Today's reading came from the section of the rule addressing humility, the 12 degrees by which a monk descended into that fundamental virtue, paradoxically rising in spiritual stature by embracing lowliness. Étienne listened with the attention these words deserved, recognizing areas where he succeeded in this endless pursuit and others where he still struggled. Pride in his work remained a constant temptation, the desire to take credit for illuminations that drew praise, to forget that his skills were gifts rather than achievements, that everything he created ultimately belonged not to him, but to the community and to God. After the reading, the abbot discussed practical matters, repairs needed in the dormitory roof before summer rains arrived, arrangements for receiving a group of pilgrims expected later in the week, the distribution of tasks for the upcoming planting season. These mundane concerns received the same careful attention as spiritual matters, recognition that the sacred and ordinary intertwined constantly, that holiness manifested as much in tending roofs and welcoming travelers as in prayer and contemplation. When the meeting concluded, Étienne returned to the Scriptorium with his mind settled, ready for the hours of work that stretched toward midday. He uncovered his desk and took up his quill, finding his place in the psalm he had been copying. The words spoke of steadfast love, of faithfulness that endured from generation to generation, of promises kept across spans of time that made individual human lives seem brief as the flowering of grass. The morning advanced through its predictable sequence, marked by the gradual movement of light across the Scriptorium's interior. Brother Philippe was making excellent progress on his martyrology, his initial research phase giving way to actual composition, words appearing on vellum as he transformed his notes and references into coherent, accurate entries. His face showed the concentration this work required, but also satisfaction at seeing the project take definite form. A messenger arrived at the Scriptorium door, a young novice who approached Brother André's desk with a wax tablet bearing a message from the abbot. André read it, nodded, and the novice departed as quietly as he had come. Whatever the message contained, it seemed to require no immediate action, and André simply set the tablet aside and returned to his translation work. Étienne completed another page and began a fresh sheet, his hand showing no sign of fatigue despite the hours of repetitive motion. This physical endurance had developed over decades, his fingers and wrist strengthened by constant use, able to maintain the precise control required for clean letter forms hour after hour. In his youth, He had often needed to stop and rest his cramping hand. Now it simply continued, reliable as the turning of seasons. The bells for sext marked midday, and the community gathered for the brief office before proceeding to dinner. Today's meal featured a thick soup made from dried beans and lentils, enriched with pieces of salted pork that added savory depth. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, accompanied the soup, along with a wedge of soft cheese that spread easily on the bread's tender interior. Spring onions from the garden added sharpness to the meal, their green shoots tender and mild. Brother Dominic read from the chronicles of early monasticism, recounting how communities of devoted Christians had formed in the centuries following the apostles, seeking to preserve faith and learning through times of upheaval and change. The parallels to their own abbey were obvious, and Étienne felt again that sense of being part of something larger than himself, a tradition extending backward through time and forward into an unknowable future. The afternoon rest period found Étienne in the cloister once more, walking slowly beneath the covered arcade. The day had grown quite warm, the spring sun asserting its strength, hinting at the summer heat that would come in a few months. But here in the cloister's shade, the temperature remained comfortable, pleasant without being enervating. He paused at the fountain, watching water flow from the lion's mouth into the stone basin, the sound both lively and peaceful. Small insects skated across the water's surface, their delicate legs dimpling but not breaking through, suspended by forces Étienne did not understand but could observe and appreciate. A swallow darted past, swift and graceful, gone almost before he registered its presence, off to pursue its own mysterious purposes. Brother Ambrose appeared from the direction of the garden, carrying a basket of early lettuce and herbs. The gardener's face showed the contentment that came from working with growing things, hands covered with honest dirt, body pleasantly tired from physical labor. He nodded to Étienne as he passed, heading toward the kitchen where the cook would transform these raw materials into the evening meal. Étienne continued his walk, completing another circuit before returning to the Scriptorium. The afternoon's work beckoned, and he felt ready for it, his body rested, his mind clear. He settled at his desk and uncovered his work, examining what he had accomplished during the morning with fresh eyes. The text looked clean and even, each line properly spaced, margins maintained with precision. Satisfied, he continued where he had left off. The psalm spoke of refuge, of hiding beneath the shadow of divine wings, of trust that allowed fear to dissolve into peace. Étienne copied these words slowly, allowing their meaning to sink into him as his quill formed each letter. This was one of the unexpected gifts of his work, how the act of copying sacred texts created space for those texts to work on his own heart, shaping him even as he shaped the manuscript. Brother Thomas had completed his decorative initials and returned to plain text copying, his quill moving in its characteristic rhythm, slightly faster than Étienne's own pace, but no less careful. Thomas hummed softly while he worked, a habit he had developed over the years, tuneless melodies that seemed to help him maintain focus. The sound was quiet enough not to disturb the others, just audible as a gentle background presence in the Scriptorium's silence. The afternoon light grew warmer and more golden as the sun descended toward the western horizon. Through the window, Étienne could see the abbey's orchard, where the cherry trees' blossoms were beginning to fade, their moment of peak beauty already passing, making way for the next stage of growth that would eventually yield fruit. This constant cycle of flowering and fading, of beauty appearing and departing, reminded him of the Psalms' frequent meditations on time's passage, on the brevity of human life compared to eternity's vastness. Yet rather than finding this thought depressing, Étienne discovered in it a kind of freedom. If life was brief, then each moment mattered precisely because it would not come again. The page before him, the letter he was forming right now, this particular Thursday afternoon in this particular spring, would never be repeated. Therefore it deserved his full attention, his complete presence, his best effort. Brother André completed another page of translation and set it aside with visible satisfaction. The gospel manuscript was progressing well, and at this rate would be completed within a few months, ready to join the Abbey's collection of sacred texts. This particular copy was destined for a daughter house, a smaller monastery founded by Saint Victor, which needed its own gospel book for liturgical use. André's work would thus serve not just this community, but another as well, extending the reach of his careful labor beyond these walls. Brother Philippe stood and walked to the supply cabinet, selecting a fresh pot of ink to replace the one he had nearly exhausted during the morning's intensive writing. He returned to his desk and poured the new ink into his pot, testing its flow on a scrap of vellum before resuming work. The martyrology was taking shape nicely, each saint's entry including feast day, brief biography, and details of martyrdom or death, all verified against multiple sources to ensure accuracy. The bells for nuns sounded, calling the community to the afternoon office. Étienne covered his work and rose, feeling the familiar stiffness in his lower back, the tightness in his shoulders that came from hours of leaning over his desk. He stretched carefully as he walked to the church, easing muscles back toward flexibility, preparing them for the evening's work that would follow this brief service. The office was particularly beautiful this afternoon, the light streaming through the church's windows creating patterns on the stone floor, illuminating the space with warmth and clarity. Étienne sang the appointed psalms with full attention, grateful for this pause in the day's labor, this opportunity to lift his voice in praise and prayer alongside his brothers. When the service concluded, he returned to the Scriptorium and his waiting desk. The Vellum seemed to welcome him back, patient and uncomplaining, ready to receive whatever marks he chose to make upon its surface. He uncovered his work and continued copying, his quill finding its rhythm immediately, requiring no period of adjustment or warm-up. The psalm neared its conclusion, the final verses speaking of glory and honor, of crowning with loving kindness and tender mercies. Étienne formed each letter with care, maintaining the same precision for these last lines as he had for the opening verses, understanding that consistency mattered, that a manuscript's value lay partly in its reliability, the reader's ability to trust that every page would be as clear and accurate as every other. As he completed the final word and set down his quill, satisfaction settled through him, quiet and deep. Another psalm copied, another small piece of the larger manuscript completed. Tomorrow would bring new pages, new psalms, the work continuing in its endless unfolding. But for now, this particular task was finished, this portion of the journey complete. The evening light painted the scriptorium walls with amber and gold, the day moving toward its gentle conclusion. Étienne cleaned his quill and covered his work, preparing to leave the desk he would return to tomorrow morning, continuing this rhythm that had structured his days for so many years and would, God willing, continue structuring them for years to come. The bells for Vespers would ring soon, calling the community to evening prayer, and after that would come supper and recreation and compline and sleep, the familiar sequence that carried him through each day's turning, each season's progression, each year's patient unfolding within the monastery's sheltering walls. The Vespers bells rang out across the abbey grounds, their bronze voices carrying through the warm afternoon air. Étienne rose from his desk and joined his brothers as they made their way to the church, their footsteps creating a soft rhythm against the cloister's worn stones. The evening light transformed the covered walkway into a gallery of amber and shadow, each column casting its elongated shape across the floor, the garden at the cloister's center glowing with the particular luminosity that came just before sunset. In the church, candles had been lit in anticipation of evening's approach, their flames steady in the still air. Étienne took his place in the choir stalls and added his voice to the community's song, the familiar melodies rising toward the vaulted ceiling. The psalms chosen for this evening spoke of harvest and abundance, of the earth yielding its increase, words that connected the spiritual life to the agricultural rhythms that governed so much of medieval existence. As he sang, Étienne found his mind drifting to the manuscript on his desk, not with anxiety or impatience, but with a kind of peaceful anticipation, looking forward to tomorrow's continuation of the work. This balance between being fully present in prayer while also holding awareness of life's other dimensions felt right to him, neither compartmentalizing his existence into separate realms nor allowing any single aspect to overwhelm the others. The service concluded with the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise, and the community filed out into the early evening. The air had cooled slightly, enough to be noticeable against skin warmed by the day's accumulated heat. Étienne walked to the refectory beside Brother André, neither speaking but comfortable in their shared silence, years of friendship making words unnecessary for simple companionship. Supper brought a pottage made with fresh peas from the garden, their sweetness a reminder that summer approached with its abundance of vegetables. The cook had added mint and a touch of butter, creating a dish that tasted of spring itself, fresh and clean, and somehow hopeful. Bread and cheese accompanied the pottage, along with a small portion of preserved quince that provided a sweet counterpoint to the meal's savory elements. Brother Lucian read from the Confessions of St. Augustine, the section where the saint reflected on time and memory, on how the past existed only in recollection, and the future only in anticipation, while the present moment was all that truly existed. Étienne listened while eating, finding in these philosophical meditations an echo of his own experience as a scribe, how each moment at his desk was complete in itself, while also connecting to all the moments that came before and would come after. The recreation period following supper found several brothers gathered in the cloister, their conversations ranging across various topics. Brother Philippe spoke enthusiastically about a particularly interesting martyrology entry he had discovered, a saint whose feast day had been celebrated on different dates in different regions, the variation apparently stemming from confusion between two different individuals with the same name who had lived a century apart. Brother Thomas discussed a challenge he was facing in his homily manuscript, where the exemplar's text seemed to contain an error, a phrase that made no grammatical sense. He was trying to decide whether to copy it exactly as it appeared or to correct what seemed an obvious mistake. The consensus among the gathered scribes was that he should copy it faithfully, but add a marginal note indicating the problem, allowing future readers to make their own determination. Étienne contributed his own thoughts on this question, nodding that he had faced similar dilemmas and generally chose to preserve what the exemplar showed, trusting that fidelity to the source mattered more than imposing his own judgment, however reasonable that judgment might be. This approach sometimes meant perpetuating errors, but it also maintained a certain honesty, a transparency about the transmission process that seemed valuable. The conversation drifted to other topics, the brothers discussing the upcoming feast of Pentecost and the special manuscripts that would be used during that celebration, the decorations being prepared for the church, the extra baking required to provide hospitality for the larger number of visitors expected. These practical matters received the same thoughtful attention as the more abstract discussions of textual accuracy, all part of the community's shared life. As twilight deepened toward full darkness, stars began appearing overhead, emerging one by one in the darkening sky. Étienne found himself gazing upward, picking out familiar constellations, recognizing patterns his father had taught him decades ago in a life that now seemed distant as those stars themselves. That young boy who had looked at the night sky from a village field could not have imagined the life that awaited him, the years that would be spent within these monastery walls, the countless hours that would pass with quill in hand, creating beauty from vellum and ink and patient attention. The bell for Compline called them to the final office, and the community gathered once more in the church. The service felt particularly peaceful tonight, prayers asking for rest and protection through the night hours, for dreams undisturbed and sleep that restored. Étienne's voice joined his brothers in the concluding antiphon, the melody simple and ancient, worn smooth by centuries of repetition, yet still capable of touching something deep within the heart. The great silence began as the service ended, and the brothers dispersed to the dormitory without speaking. Étienne prepared for sleep with his customary care, each small task performed mindfully, a final meditation before surrendering to rest. When he knelt for private prayer beside his bed, he found himself offering gratitude for the day's work, for hands still capable and eyes still clear, for the privilege of spending his life in service of beauty and sacred text. Sleep came easily, pulling him down into its restoring depths. The night passed in its timeless rhythm, stars wheeling overhead, the monastery settling into stillness while the world continued its ancient turnings. When the matins bell rang in the pre-dawn darkness, Étienne rose to begin another day, the cycle continuing as it had for so long, as it would continue for however many days remained to him. The early offices passed in their familiar sequence, matins and lauds and prime marking the progression from night into day. Breakfast brought porridge again, this time cooked with dried apples that had been chopped fine and added to the oats, their sweetness making the simple dish particularly satisfying. Brother Matthias read from the prophets, verses about restoration and renewal, about new beginnings that God offered to those who turned toward the light. The morning light in the Scriptorium held exceptional clarity, the air washed clean by a brief shower that had fallen during the night. Étienne uncovered his desk and examined yesterday's work, seeing that the final page of the completed psalm looked good, the text clean and even. Today he would begin a new psalm, one that spoke of mountains and streams, of the natural world declaring divine glory through its mere existence. Before starting the text, he decided to work on the capital L he had sketched earlier, the one showing a figure in prayer. He prepared his pigments, mixing colors and shells, selecting brushes appropriate for the work ahead. The figure would be rendered in muted tones, browns and grays suggesting monastic robes. The background kept simple to emphasize the praying figure rather than competing for attention. He began with the outline, using a fine pen and black ink to define the figure's form, the boat head, the folded hands, the way the robe fell in simple folds. The architectural elements behind received similar treatment, columns and arches suggested with minimal lines, enough to establish context without overwhelming the composition. The work required complete focus, each stroke deliberate and considered, building the illumination line by line. Brother Thomas was starting a new section of his homily manuscript, one that required him to create several decorative borders around the text. He had prepared colored inks, red and blue and green, and was using them to create intricate patterns of interlaced vines and geometric shapes that framed the words without obscuring them. His work showed skill and patience, each small element contributing to a larger pattern that revealed itself gradually as the page developed. The morning advanced through its predictable rhythm, light moving across the Scriptorium's interior, marking time's passage. Étienne completed the outline of the capital L and began applying color, starting with the figure's robes, using a brown mixed from several pigments to achieve exactly the right tone, neither too warm nor too cool, suggesting simple wool fabric worn by one devoted to prayer rather than display. Brother André was working on a particularly lyrical passage in his gospel translation, a section where Jesus spoke in parables and metaphors that required careful handling to preserve their poetic quality while rendering them accurately in Latin. The older scribe's face showed deep concentration, his lips moving slightly as he tried different phrasings, seeking words that would capture both meaning and music. By the time Terce arrived, the capital L's figure was taking shape, the colors filling in the outlined forms, transforming flat lines into something that suggested depth and presence. Étienne covered his work and joined his brothers for the brief office, grateful for the pause, the opportunity to stand and stretch, to lift his voice in praise alongside the community. After the service, he returned to the Scriptorium and continued with the illumination, adding details to the architectural background, touches of color that suggested stone and shadow, creating space around the praying figure. The work progressed steadily, each small addition refining the overall effect, bringing the composition closer to the vision he had held in his mind since first sketching the design. The morning's light grew stronger as the sun climbed higher, flooding the scriptorium with brightness that made it easy to see fine details. Étienne worked with confidence born of decades of practice, his hand steady, his eye trained to judge proportions and placements accurately. The capital L was becoming one of his better illuminations, he thought, the composition balanced and the execution clean. Brother Philippe paused in his own work to rise and walk to the window, standing there for a long moment, simply gazing out at the view. When he returned to his desk, his face showed the refreshment that came from brief mental rest, the value of stepping away occasionally to maintain clarity and prevent the kind of exhaustion that led to errors. Étienne understood this need intimately, having learned through experience that pushing too hard for too long diminished, rather than enhanced the work's quality. The discipline of the monastic schedule, with its regular interruptions for prayer and meals, actually supported better work by enforcing these necessary pauses, preventing the kind of stubborn persistence that could lead a scribe to continue past the point where his judgment remained sound. The bells for sext marked midday, and the community gathered for the brief office before proceeding to dinner. Today's meal featured a grain dish made from barley cooked with vegetables and herbs, served alongside bread, and a salad of spring greens dressed with oil and vinegar. The food was simple but satisfying, providing nourishment for both body and spirit. The communal meal itself, a form of fellowship that bound the brothers together. Brother Dominic read from the Desert Fathers again, focusing today on sayings about discernment, the ability to distinguish between thoughts that led toward God and those that led away, between genuine spiritual insight and mere emotional reaction. Étienne listened while eating, recognizing the relevance of these ancient teachings to his own life, the constant need to examine his motivations, to ensure that pride or vanity or other distortions didn't corrupt the purity of his service. The afternoon rest period brought him to the library, where he spent time examining another Psalter from the Abbey's collection, this one created perhaps 30 years earlier. The illuminations showed a different style than his own, more elaborate and decorative, filled with intricate border decorations and multiple colors competing for attention. Étienne appreciated the skill displayed, but felt confirmed in his own preference for simpler compositions that served the text rather than overwhelming it. Returning to the scriptorium, he worked through the afternoon on completing the capital L, adding final details, small touches of white that suggested highlights, tiny refinements that brought the entire composition together. By the time none arrived, the illumination was essentially complete, requiring only the gold application that he would undertake tomorrow after the colors had fully dried. The afternoon office provided its customary break, and afterward Étienne began copying the text of the new psalm, his quill moving in its familiar rhythm. The words spoke of longing for God's presence, of seeking and finding, of thirst being satisfied and hunger being filled. As he copied these verses, Étienne reflected on how his own life embodied this seeking, how the daily discipline of prayer and work created space for encounter with the divine, not through dramatic visions or mystical experiences, but through the quiet faithfulness of showing up, day after day, to do the work before him. The afternoon light grew warmer and more golden as evening approached, and Étienne continued writing, adding line after line to the growing manuscript, contributing another day's work to a project that stretched across months and would eventually span years. The afternoon light continued its slow transformation, amber deepening toward the richer gold that preceded sunset. Étienne completed the line he was writing and set down his quill, looking at the page before him with quiet satisfaction. The text flowed cleanly across the vellum, each letter formed with care, the Psalm's words preserved in script that would endure for generations beyond his own lifetime. He cleaned his quill with methodical attention, rinsing away the ink, drying the feather thoroughly, ensuring it would be ready for tomorrow's continuation. The brushes used for the capital L received similar care, each one cleaned and reshaped, then set aside to dry overnight. These tools were extensions of his hands, faithful servants of his craft, and they deserved the respect that came with proper maintenance. The bells for Vespers began their evening call, bronze voices carrying across the abbey grounds and beyond, marking the day's gentle turn toward night. Étienne covered his work for the final time today, the linen cloth settling over the vellum like a blessing, protecting what had been created during the hours of focused labor. He rose from his desk and joined his brothers, their footsteps creating a soft procession through the cloister toward the church. The evening air held that particular quality of peace that came at day's end, coolness mingling with the lingering warmth, the world settling into the quietness that preceded night's full arrival. In the church, candlelight created pools of golden warmth against the gathering shadows. Étienne took his place in the choir and lifted his voice with his brothers, singing the evening office, the psalms of praise and thanksgiving that had been sung in this space for generations. The familiar words rose toward the vaulted ceiling, filling the church with melody that seemed to linger even after the voices fell silent. The service flowed through its appointed sequence, each prayer and response following ancient patterns, connecting this particular Thursday evening to all the Thursday evenings that had come before and would come after, an unbroken chain of devotion extending through time. When the final prayer was spoken and the community began to file out, Étienne paused for a moment, his hands resting on the choir stall's smooth wood, feeling the weight of the day releasing from his shoulders. He walked to the refectory with Brother André, the two men comfortable in their companionable silence. Supper brought soup made from leeks and potatoes, simple and nourishing, served with bread and a small portion of cheese. The food warmed him from within, preparing his body for the evening's final hours. After the meal, the brief recreation period found him walking alone in the cloister, his pace unhurried, his mind resting in the peace that comes when the day's work is done and sleep approaches. The stars overhead were beginning their nightly appearance, emerging one by one as darkness deepened, the same stars that had shone over scribes and monks for centuries, the same stars that would shine over those who would come after. The bell for Compline called him to the final office, and he made his way to the church through the gathering night. The service felt like a gentle closing, prayers asking for peaceful rest and protection through the darkness, for dreams undisturbed and renewal that would come with morning's light. When Compline ended and the great silence began, Étienne walked to the dormitory with his brothers, their footsteps soft against stone worn smooth by countless passages. In the quiet space beside his bed, he prepared for sleep with the same careful attention he brought to his work, each small task a final meditation before rest. He knelt for private prayer, offering gratitude for the day's blessings, for the manuscript growing page by page beneath his hands, for the community that sheltered and sustained him, for the calling that had given his life purpose and meaning. Then he climbed beneath the blankets and lay listening to the night sounds, the settling of ancient timbers, the whisper of wind through the orchard, the distant voice of an owl calling into the darkness. His breathing slowed and deepened as sleep approached. The day's images drifted through his mind like leaves on a gentle stream, the capital L taking shape beneath his brush, sunlight moving across his desk, the taste of evening soup, his brothers' voices rising in song. Each memory settled softly, without grasping or holding, simply acknowledged before releasing into the peace that comes before dreams. Tomorrow would bring another morning, another journey to the Scriptorium, another day of patient work with vellum and ink and careful attention. The manuscript would continue its slow growth, page by page, psalm by psalm, illumination by illumination, until one day it would stand complete. But that completion lay months or years in the future, and Étienne felt no urgency to rush toward it. The work itself was enough, the daily showing up, the faithful application of skill in service of beauty and sacred text. Outside his window, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. The Seine flowed past the city walls, its waters carrying reflections of moonlight toward the distant sea. The monastery settled into its nightly stillness, stone and timber holding the community in protective embrace, while the world continued its vast turnings. Étienne's breathing grew slower still, his body releasing the day's accumulated tension, muscles softening into the mattress's support. The capital L waited on his desk for tomorrow's gold. The unfinished psalm waited for its continuation. The long journey of manuscript creation waited for his return. But for now, there was only this moment of deepening rest, this gentle surrender to sleep's restoring darkness, this peaceful conclusion to another day, lived faithfully within the rhythms that had sustained his community for generations, and would sustain it for generations more. His last conscious thought touched briefly on the words he had copied that afternoon, the psalm's promise of streams in the desert, of sustenance provided, of thirsts being satisfied. Then even that thought dissolved, and he drifted down into sleep's quiet depths, where no words existed, only the wordless peace that held all things, the silence from which all sound emerged and to which all sound returned, the stillness at the heart of everything, eternal and unchanging, present in this medieval scriptorium as in all times and places, now and forever, world without end.